From the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, and this is, of course, talking about Europe. First major set of changes that we'll be talking about in developments is through technology. And there's sort of a wide variety of things that happen here, but it's worth keeping in mind that most of the technological changes that take place in Europe in this point of time are not original to Europe. What's happening is through trade, through expansion through the Crusades, through a variety of ways, they are coming in contact with technology from other places, often from the Islamic world, sometimes from Asia, the far part of Asia, China, and then they're taking those technologies and adapting them and further developing them. One of the most important is wind and water wheels. These are important because, of course, what it does is it allows you to move from the power that you can create simply with the physical body, either from the human's body in order to move things, or actually through the animal's body by hitching them to a wheel to move things. And so that dramatically increases the amount of power you can have. It's not really a new technology at all, but what they do is it becomes a very popular and powerful technology. It's further developed, and basically anywhere that has a river that you can put a water wheel in it, anywhere that's a good site for windmills, are used for these. And really, literally, pretty much all the good sites on rivers are taken by this. And they use them for grinding grain, which is what you're seeing here. They're bringing the grain here to be turned into flour, but also for things like paper making iron, all kinds of other kinds of techniques are being used by using these wheels. Next big set of changes comes with the clocks. Clocks, once again, that's an Asian technology. They come from China, actually. And they come with them a huge amount of changes in the way that people think. You have to remember, when you're talking about medieval Europe, their way of telling time is mostly done by the sun, which means that very literally, the length of time that you measure changes depending on the season. So your day is from basically dawn to dusk when the sun goes down. Well, in the winter, that's a lot shorter when the sun, it's a lot shorter period of time when the sun is out than it is in summer. And so you measure basically from dawn to noon when the sun is directly overhead, so you can measure that. From noon to sunset, you break it up into sort of shorter periods of time within that. But obviously, the amount of time you work, the amount of time you put into a unit, the length of time that goes into each unit of time changes depending on the season of the year. What clocks do is they change that, because a clock works by a mechanism that's fixed. An hour is an hour is an hour, just like a minute is a minute, though they're not very good at measuring actual minutes for the most part. That means that you are measuring time in a way that doesn't change. And so increasingly, how long you work, how long your duties take, all those kinds of things that govern your day are being governed by this rigid clock. So the concepts that we're very familiar with today, like having an 8-hour workday or having to show up at a certain time for class, things like that, are really dependent on this technology, and this technology becoming so popular and widespread. At the beginning, these clocks, when we're talking about the medieval period, they're way too expensive for a personal luxury. And please ignore any chewing noises you're hearing. That's my dog, and he's trying to, crack the marrow of his plastic bone, which isn't going to work. Anyways, because they're so much of a luxury, because they were so expensive, it's not something that an individual has. Plus, these clocks, the original mechanisms, are really large. And so what they do is they have clocks at the center of a town. And so this is basically a very old city clock going back to the 13th century, still in existence, still working in Switzerland. And so something like that, a clock that's at the center of a city, at the center of a monastery, and then often they would ring bells so that people all around the city would hear the noise and know as the different times changed. Books and the printing press, another major transformation. You have to keep in mind that books had really been, in Europe, a luxury item because of the amount of time that was taken to copy them. And if you look at that monk up there, that scribe who's very carefully copying out his book, the manuscript, that's how books used to be made. And so you can imagine each individual book under those circumstances is going to be a work of art. Something that an individual puts time on. It's usually commissioned for someone wealthy or for a large monastery. And often these works will have extra writing, drawing. They might even be decorated with jewels if it's made for a wealthy patron. They're not something that just anyone can have. What the printing press does is it makes it possible for a much wider range of people to get the printed word. And so it's basically a mechanism for making a large number of books at a time. As you can see here, what they're doing is they're having a machine that they feed the paper in. The page gets stamped down multiple times. You get multiple copies of it. What they're doing there is they're dealing with the pages as they come out of the printer. And that's an older technology. Once again an older technology, but when they're putting into new use. And then also, in addition to that, is the use of movable type. Once again, that's a Chinese technology, but it's one that didn't work particularly well for them because they had so many different symbols that having each symbol on a piece of type to be arranged really wasn't a time savings for them. So instead, they would use carved wood blocks for the entire page. But in Europe, where they're using an alphabet which only has 26 letters, that really works quite well. And so what you're looking at there is an array of those 26 letters, multiple ones of them, that have been lined up to make a page. And they're going to print that page multiple times. That's what you're seeing in your lower right. And when they're done printing it multiple times, at that point, they take it all apart, rearrange the letters, and they set up the next page. What this means is that books become cheap. It also allows the production of even cheaper types of writing to be available to people besides books. So a broadsheet would be a single sheet of paper. On that you might have a wood-carved drawing and a ballad, a popular song, possibly an important piece of news, an announcement. Something like that could be quite cheap, easily distributed, and could be available to a lot of people who don't even have enough money to buy a book. And then, of course, those sheets, once they're bought by somebody, that person can then go to the local tavern, can go home to their house, can go to a variety of places, and often you might be the only person there who can read, but you read it out loud. So it's not just a matter of increasing the number of books well-educated people can buy. It's making printing and news more available to a wide variety of people with varying levels of literacy skills, and even those who can't read get access through other people who can. Next big set of changes are really propelled by economic change that's brought by the rebirth of trade. I don't know if you remember, but when the western half of the Roman Empire collapses, pretty much that's the end of a lot of travel, a lot of trade, a lot of cities within Europe itself. There's nothing there to support them with the collapse of the Pax Romana, and so they sort of disappear. What's happening in this period is a lot of that trade is coming back, both internally within Europe itself, and that's a lot of those orange lines you're seeing, but then also externally, pretty much all going across the Mediterranean, you'll see that it's hooking in to eastward heading trade routes, and that's linking it into the big trade routes across Asia and the Indian Ocean. Within Europe, a lot of what keeps it going are local markets, sometimes within a town, like the kind of thing you're seeing there, where the local people on the picture on, I guess it would be your left, are buying local goods, various luxuries, things like that, but also massive markets for large goods that are going to be used for massive reasons. So what you're seeing there, the sheepfold is one of the biggest markets, one of the biggest things that Europe produces that people are interested in at this point in time is actually wool cloth. And so there's massive amounts of sheep being made. The areas that make the sheep, they shear the sheep, massive amounts of wool get shipped. Massive amounts of wool that gets shipped out to people who turn it into cloth, and then you ship the cloth. And so, in addition to these city markets where people are buying local stuff, you also have these massive outdoor markets where large quantities of goods are traded. And some of those are in cities, and a lot of them are actually independent of that. Cities are an incredibly important growth of this. And you see the rebirth of a lot of cities that have sort of gone into decay and pretty much disappeared. And in other cases, you actually see the birth of new cities. Cities were thriving. There are places where you're seeing great displays of wealth and culture. The building of cathedrals is a good example of that, these huge building projects. There are also places that have a lot of economic vitality. They're also hugely polluted and hugely disease filled, to the point at which that any kind of city, usually they can't really survive on their own population growth because such a high percentage of them die young or die as children. And so they're pretty much, cities depend on people from the countryside deciding they want to go and make a living in the city, find opportunities in the city. And so coming from the countryside, moving into the city, and embracing this new urban lifestyle. So you can sort of see these cities almost as a pump where the new water, the new people flowing in from all over come into these cities and become part of this vital activity that's going on. And it won't survive if it doesn't have those new people coming in from the outside to keep it going. Workmen, the people who make things, are organized in guilds for the most part. And these were sort of basically organizations, groups of skilled craftsmen. And the idea was it was meant to be a way of training people, of making sure that people would learn those particular skills. So what you see there, it's a master baker. He's doing his baking. And next to him, he's got his apprentice. He's made a contract with that boy's father, parent probably, or some organization in order to take him in. The apprentice has to work for him, stay with him a certain number of years, and in the process, he's supposed to keep him clothed, keep him fed, and train him how to become a master baker. And if he's good enough, he'll become a journeyman baker. That's the next. And then eventually, when he becomes a good enough journeyman, he'll become a master baker. He'll have his own shop, and he'll get to take in and train apprentices himself. Part of it's also a way for craftsmen to try to control their own economic system. If everybody in the town who makes shoes is a member of the shoemaking guild, then everybody in town can agree that they're not going to charge less than a certain amount. And so they can try to have some kind of economic control. It's also supposed to be a way to look out for yourself if you become ill. If you die, there's supposed to be someone out there who's supposed to look out for your widow, your orphan children, have some kind of backup. There really isn't a separation like we're accustomed to thinking about between family life and work life. Usually you do your work in your home. They might probably live above the bakery. In this case, the family does. The apprentices live with the family, and usually the wife, the children would help out in the business at least part of the time. And that's actually the only way a woman is going to become a craftsman, acknowledged as a master craftsman, is if her husband dies and she's left to keep care of the shop and keep the business going. At which point, the fact that she's developed all these skills working with him will allow her to take over. But she's not going to be accepted as a master if she tries for that on her own. The final thing that guilds do is they kept people out. That's why if you're a woman, you can't become a guild master, a member of the guild fully, unless you're somebody's widow. They're not going to take a woman. They're also not going to take you if you're a Jew, frequently if you're a foreigner. Possibly not if you don't have a family connection or the right apprenticeship. So guilds are protection for the craftsman more than anything else. The development of banking is also really critically important, and it involves developing a lot of financial tools that we can use for long distance trade without having to actually be there. So the equivalent of checking accounts. Basically you can have your money deposited in Venice, but you're writing your check in London or Constantinople. Something that's very familiar to us today was pretty innovative for them at that time. The ability to get loans to help with your business, or if you're trying to set out a cargo, trying to get set for a particular trading voyage. Basically also some other kinds of financial support, financial institutions. They also become very important as bankers as basically financial support for the powers that be, loaning money to leaders of the church, loaning money to kings, lords, people like that. It's not always a good decision, by the way, if you're a banker to do that, because if you have a problem and the king won't pay you, you really don't have any safe recourse to that. And there are bankers who go broke because of who they lent money to. External trade really goes one way. It goes through the Mediterranean, and it's controlled by the northern Italian cities. Venice, Genoa. Genoa is going to sound familiar. That's where Columbus is from. A lot of the early explorers are people who come from this trade. That's why they're familiar with it and how powerful it can be. Those northern Italian cities, particularly Venice, control that trade with a heavy hand. And so what you're seeing there is the Navy of Venice basically fending off someone who's trying to move in on their trade routes. That trade across the Mediterranean is the only way to connect in with those huge world of trade that's Asia, Africa, the Indian Ocean, which is where a lot of the really important luxuries and goods come from. And that's really where you can make the most amount of money, is through those luxury long distance trade. It's stuff that Europeans desperately want. It's stuff that they're willing to pay for. It makes these northern Italian cities very, very wealthy to start with. And actually, Venice begins to learn to take advantage of that and start making some of the goods that people want. This is also, by the way, going to be the driving force when we talk about voyages of exploration. Why does Columbus set out? Why does Vasco da Gama set out? Why do these various people set out? Really what they're looking for is a way to get to those trade routes and breaking the monopoly that Venice and the other northern Italian cities have over the Mediterranean. Renaissance, the actual changes in the intellectual culture. And you'll notice the term Renaissance there. It's French for rebirth. And it uses that term because in a lot of ways, they are people who thought of themselves not of creating something new, but actually going back and recreating something that existed before. And actually, this painting, it's a Renaissance painting, but what they're showing there is all the great philosophers of Athens. And I think that sort of encapsulates the fact that they're creating something new. In our terms, we look at it and we see what's new about it. But from their terms, they really saw it as a rebirth, a redrawing of what was there before. A critical part of this is rediscovering their classical heritage, which comes from contact with Muslim societies. Because the thing is, when the western half of the Roman Empire collapsed, so did the collections of books. It's pretty easy to happen, by the way, because historically, scrolls, what we would consider the ancestors of books, eventually they rot, just like ours will today, but even quicker because they're not protected in the same way our modern techniques for making books are. And so what that means is if you stop copying them over and over and over like they learned to do, they'll just rot away. The bookworms will get them. There actually are bookworms. They'll turn into dust. And what happens is with monasteries being left during the Middle Ages as really the only center of culture, what they're interested in keeping the church fathers, keeping the religious heritage of Christianity alive. They're really not interested in pagan philosophers. They're really not interested in a lot of this other stuff. On the other hand, the Muslim world had been very interested in that. They've just been having, under the Mongols and the times that follow, that huge, I guess you could say, cultural flourishing of their own. A huge amount of attention paid to gathering together texts, translating them to Arabic, becoming familiar with them. And so as Europe comes in contact with people from those Muslim worlds, it happens through trade, peaceful contact. It also happens through the sort of going, first of all, peaceful living and then conflict that happens in Spain, which is actually Muslim controlled, the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal as well. So all through these different ways, they come into contact and they rediscover this past. And just to put it there, you're seeing a picture, in this case, an Arabic picture, and that's Aristotle there and people learning from him. Along with that, there's actually a rediscovery of Christianity. And what you're seeing there is a portrait of Erasmus, one of the great scholars of this. But it's actually a rediscovery of the past. What they have for the Bible is what's called the Latin Vulgate. Basically, it's been copied over and over and over again. Remember, to keep those scrolls from deteriorating, that's been going on through this period of the medieval period. Well, what they find when they start looking at these older texts is they find the older texts of the Bible as well. And remember that the Bible was written over a period of time in a variety of languages. And so they start this process that is actually still going on today of finding older and older versions of the original text. And in that, they find, first of all, that a lot of errors have crept in as it's been copied over and over. So they fix that. They become aware of the way that the text of the Bible has changed over time and the way that people have interpreted it and written it. And so that causes a new kind of critical thinking about it and trying to understand it. It also leads to a process of trying to make the Bible more available. The medieval Bible was only supposed to be in Latin. The idea is that you're protecting people because if they read it for themselves, they may misinterpret it, they may be led astray. But this new movement involves translating, we call it translating in the vernacular. Basically, that just means the translating it into the languages that ordinary people speak. So instead of it just being in Latin, you put it in English, you put it in Spanish, you put it in German. You make it available for people to read in a much wider way. And actually, you will notice that that is followed by people getting their own ideas about what it means and the Protestant Reformation and all those kinds of changes. But it really is a rediscovery of the Bible, a rediscovery of thinking of the Bible. One final thing that goes into that as well is attempts by various scholars to try to use the philosophy that they're learning from these new pagan texts that they're coming back to and thinking about the theology itself. And this is how, well, a variety of things are going to happen, but this is also how Aristotle gets into Christian theology, and that's how Galileo gets in trouble, but that's a whole nother story. Universities are places which attract a lot of these thinkings. Basically, a university originally, it's a guild of scholars. Either a guild of students or a guild of doctors, people who are thinking. And so they're basically people who are professional thinkers. Often they're clerics. Sort of theology was seen as the queen of the sciences, but it would also provide training in other things. Usually, the way it would work is that they were often international. If you were a student, you would sort of go to wherever the people were that you wanted to study with. And so you would travel from place to go to study. What you're looking at there, by the way, is a portrait of an early guild of scholars, beginnings of the university. They're often focused in cities as where they're built, and they're often places that are seen as being very troublesome, all kinds of complaints about students. And this is just a 14th century complaint about the kinds of things that students get up to get you an idea. One, sometimes they wish to be above their masters, challenging their statements with more certain wrong-headedness than with reason. They attend classes but make no effort to learn anything. They frequently learn what they would better ignore, such things as forbidden sciences, love-making, and superstitions. They're often disobedient, and for which he says they should be beaten. They go to church, and instead they have fun with their friends. And the money that they have from their parents or churches, they spend in taverns, conversation, games, and other uselessness, and they return home empty without knowledge, conscience, or money. I'll leave it up to you whether or not that's a description of college life today. So we've talked about technology, we've talked about economics, we've talked about culture, and here we're talking about politics. Big change here is in the creation of what are called sometimes the new kings, and we're really specifically talking here about England, France, and Spain, and the changes that come with them. And I think it's worth pointing out that when we talk about England, France, and Spain as new kings having sort of new kinds of ways of ruling, those are also the countries that are going to be heavily involved with expanding outside of Europe with colonization, imperialism, the voyages of exploration. And of course, what you're seeing there is a picture of one of the most famous of the new kings, though we would call her queen. That's Queen Elizabeth II being carried in a procession through the streets by her nobles. Okay, the old feudal system. The thing about the old feudal system, and what we have there is a man, basically promising his fealty, his support to his superior who is going to give him in return the offerings. Basically, remember the thing about feudalism is that if you're a king, you're only as powerful as your nobles are. And in fact, if you want to pull together an army, if you want to do something, your nobles have got to go along with it because they're the ones who actually have the armies that you're going to do something with. That means that as king, you really always have this problem of trying to get your nobles to work with you. Plus, there's always the risk that one of them may decide that they would be a better king than you are. In these armies, really, the nobles and their knights on horseback are the backbone of the army, supported with peasant foot soldiers, but really you depend on those knights. So under the feudal system, kings have limited access to wealth, limited access to military power, and they're just not as powerful as they could be. One of the ongoing restrictions that even in the new kingdoms are going to face is that kings have limited funds, which means limited power. A large piece of that is because The local authorities are often nobles. Another piece of it as well is that in most of these cases, they have to get some kind of group to go along with them in order to pass taxes. In the case of England, it's Parliament. In the case of France, it's the Estates General. But basically, if they want to raise taxes, they've got to get someone to agree. And there's Parliament, the very first beginnings of it, getting there with King Edward, discussing whether or not they're going to give him taxes so that he can actually do something. It also means that if you are king, you have to call up these people, and you've got to sort of decide whether getting the tax revenue is worth actually running the risk that they might challenge you. And I think it's worth noting here that much later on, there's both going to be a king of England and a king of France who are pretty much executed by their legislatures. So you can see why they thought that it was a risky thing. So they look for alternatives. And they borrow money, huge amounts of money. They get support when they can from their nobles and the clergy, the churches. That is supposed to be get nobles support from nobles and clergy, the church. They tax trade and merchants, and so that growing economic growth is also followed by taxation of it to try to help political growth, and also from cities. A lot of times where the cities grow up, they're not necessarily under the control of local nobility. And so often they will have a sort of direct relationship with royalty because they're the ones who may hold authority over them, may hold power over them, and so they're more likely to get resources directly from them. London and the King or Queen of England is a good example of that. What helps these new kings gain power is really a military transformation. Once again, none of these techniques are actually new to Europe, but the thing that is new is that actually there's this huge push in Europe and a huge amount of competition and warfare. Whereas in places like Asia, even to some extent Africa, other places, it's a relatively peaceful time period, which means that the people who are really worrying about fighting, the people who are willing to worry about the technology, improve the technology, or in constant race to make better military technology, are the people in Europe. So the constant warfare means that they are going to be technologically more advanced in terms of warfare. It's also going to give them a real advantage when you start talking about the voyages of exploration, because they're going to take this concentrated military technology, military techniques that they've been developing, and use them against the rest of the world. The basic focus of what they're developing here, longbows, crossbows, firearms, cannons, pikes, you notice that all of these are things that basically make knights irrelevant. If you can take your long pike and you have your foot soldiers and they punch through the knight's armor, he falls off his horse, he's dead. You can kill him then. Same things with what you can do with these powerful longbows, the crossbows, the firearms over time when they get better, the long distance cannon attacks. These are all things that make it so that having ordinary soldiers, not these expensive knights on horseback, are more important. They're also all things that require the investment in the technology, but they're also all things that you can basically conscript a soldier and teach him how to use this technology and have him on foot, obedient to you as a soldier in a fairly short period of time. So that military revolution, building on all these other changes, and these new kings that emerge from it with it, are really going to transform not just the face of Europe, but as I've sort of been trying to allude to, in the next semester you'll learn more about it, they're going to change the face of the world. Thank you.